Oh, good. All right. So, good afternoon. Let's continue with our systemic anatomy classes. I'm putting this in full screen mode. I think I'm online. I hope I'm clearly audible also. And let's proceed with the discussion of the musculoskeletal system. So till yesterday, we were discussing about the bones. What is this component, which is a very important, bulky, strong, visible, palpable, supportive component of this musculoskeletal system, and forms the skeleton, which is a set of bones which are interrelated with each other through what we call articulations or joints. So one component of the musculoskeletal system is joints itself. But joints by themselves are areas at which bones or parts of bones come very close. They approximate each other and very intimately interlink up with each other and form either mobile or immovable areas, so that this organism, the animal, can move its various body parts against each other or can move the whole body through space, right? Which means locomote, which means move across areas using these bones against each other. But what makes this movement possible is another very different, a whole different tissue called muscle. And that muscle is something which has an extraordinarily different property of being able to use energy to generate contraction, which will bring about this movement of one bone against the other and therefore move this joint spaces and therefore cause motion as such, motion for the body parts and locomotion for the entire animal. Cartilages are a separate subset of tissue which are very intimately connected with the bones within this musculoskeletal system, and they have very different properties from bones, and those properties are very essential for their particular function of allowing bones to smoothly and without any friction interface with one another, and also to bring about a certain amount of protection without becoming rigid. Bone has to make things, has to protect things, has to give attachment to muscles and tendons and ligaments. And to be able to do that, it has to become very rigid and inflexible, and for that its tissue structure changes into a mineralized one. Cartilage doesn't allow mineralization. To allow a certain flexibility plus protection package. It's very unique, very different. There's a trade-off between how strong you are and how flexible you are. And cartilage does it by adopting an internal structure which may be more towards flexible, in which case it becomes one type of cartilage, or may become more towards protection and strength, which makes it another kind of cartilage. And then there is one in between. So we will see that always, 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 structure is decided by the function, right? So the function that that item is going to do is going to determine what structure it adopts. And this is a dynamic state. It isn't going to continuously throughout its life be the same way, because sometimes function will also evolve with the age or the stage or the requirement of the individual. And sometimes it is just it's like a flowering. In the beginning you're a bud, and then you're a flower, and then you're a fruit. So at different stages or through its progression of life, that tissue may take up different responsibility or different function, and therefore its structure must also adapt and change to make the new functions happen and to let the old functions go. So you will see that the whole of homeostasis, of attaining that dynamic equilibrium and balance in the body, is a continuous 24/7 360-degree process, and there's a whole bunch of metabolism and biochemistry happening to deliver this functionality in a smooth, coordinated way, which is what makes us one of the most sophisticated creations that we know in the world. So coming back to what we are going to do next, musculoskeletal system, we dealt with the bones and the way the science has defined it, has divided it, has classified it and studied it and named it. Next, let's go to muscle. So in muscle, we will look at what we as scientists have demarcated it into, depending on what we know of its microstructure and what are its feasibilities, what can it do and what can it not do. So you already know that they're divided into skeletal, smooth and cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle, as the name indicates, is that which is related to your skeleton. So in musculoskeletal system, that is the muscle that we are looking at. The other two kinds of muscle are not really related to the musculoskeletal system, got nothing to do with it. They have completely different functions. They form parts of different organs. They're found in different areas. But still, because we're talking about muscle as a component, we will touch upon these types too. So the skeletal muscle is also called voluntary muscle or striated muscle or striped muscle. We'll see why. The other two types are the visceral and the cardiac muscles. Visceral is also the non-striated as opposed to striated, and involuntary as opposed to voluntary. Cardiac has features of feasibilities of both in a very unique package and is only found in a very, very limited component of some part of the cardiovascular system. The skeletal muscles in general, as the name suggests, have to be attached to bone on one side, and on the other side they usually are attached to another structure called a tendon, which is where the muscle action is leveraged. This tendon is not a contractile element. It is like a rope which can't contract or expand by itself, but it can transfer the force of contraction and pull or push upon something to which it is attached. Skeletal muscle can be divided according to its shape, like we did for bones, right? So if it is a square-shaped, flat muscle, all the fibers are laid down in such a way that there is a width and a length, not much of a thickness. Then we'll call it a quadrilateral muscle. If it has got a good amount of length, little bit of width and not much of thickness, it's like a strap, then we call it a strap muscle. If this strap is long but in between to multiply, to increase its strength without too much bulk of muscle fiber itself. That means to make it more efficient. With less amount of muscle tissue, you're still getting more amount of efficient muscular contraction. You can have the same strap with tendinous intersections. That means little quadrilaterals, one behind the other in a linear attachment. But the whole thing is described as one muscle, and the in-between bits are called its tendinous intersection. So this is another design which we can have for the flat kind of skeletal muscles. If it's not flat, if it's not like a flattened out arrangement of muscle fibers, but rather like a cylindrical arrangement of muscle fibers where it has a certain bulk. Usually the center part of it will be more bulky, and there'll be one or two ends of it which will be a little narrower. So that is what is called spindle shaped. I don't know, do you all understand? You'll have come across this word spindle before. We don't use that. Your generation has probably never seen a spindle in your life. I have barely seen one as a child. You remember there used to be something called a charkha, a weaving machine, long time back in the Khadi movement. So when you weave thread and you extract the thread, you utilize a small contraption called a spindle, which is this shape. So fusiform means spindle shaped, and that is one of the shapes we have for skeletal muscle. So this is a classification of the muscle depending on shape. The first one was strap shaped, which could be quadrilateral or a full strap or a strap with tendinous intersections. If it is not strap shaped but is rather spindle or cylindrical shaped, then it could be fusiform, or it could be fusiform but in two bits. So it's acting at one end and acting at the other end, but in between it's divided, the fleshy fibers are divided into two bunches, both of which are fusiform, and having an in-between tendinous bit to allow it to do some mechanical function which is required for it. In this case, the meaning is digastric, meaning two bellies. So it is a fusiform muscle but with two fusiform bellies, and a single muscle because it does one single action. Right? It is present here near the floor of the mouth, the upper part of the neck area. We will look at it when it comes, but that is one of the types of muscles as per its classification according to shape. Then these fusiform bunches could be 2 or 3 or 4, all commonly acting through their tendinous insertion or attachment. So then if there are two, we'll call it digastric, two bellies. If there are 3, we could call it trigastric, but we don't. We call it tricipital. And if there are 4, we should call it quadricipital. We call them the quadriceps. We have the quads. Those of you who do gymming, you know where your quads are? Okay, homework. Find out where the quadriceps muscle is. Alright, so the point is that the terminology is coming from the number of bellies that it has, all of which have to share a common insertion or attachment, which is why they will bring about a strong common action because of into 4 multiplication of muscle fibers. Then it could be a triangular muscle because its dimension is somewhat triangular. Actually, this is more flat muscle, but we're not calling it strap or anything because it is triangular in shape. We're giving it the name triangular, but it is still more flattened. It's not a cylindrical but a little more flattened shape. Then we have muscles which could be having their fibers in such a way that at some point, some of the fibers at least, are literally at right angles to each other. That means cross-shaped, and so we call it cruciate. So the muscle action is such that some of the fibers are doing something and some other fibers are doing something in a slightly different direction. But the whole muscle operates as one piece because probably the movement that needs to be brought about requires 2 components of action. We will come to that as we study each muscle in its own space. Sometimes, like we saw in the first picture, you have one side a bony attachment where the muscle is attached to the bone which it is trying to move probably. Then the muscle is a thick slab of contractile elements, all of which are inserting into one linear structure or a tendon. So it looks like the half of a leaf, right? You've seen how a leaf shape is where you have a central axis or a support, and then the leaf seems to radiate out from the central support, right, in taking up its leaf shape. So they use the word penna right from the beginning to name this shape of the muscle. So the morphological types of skeletal muscle include those which are unipennate, which means they're going to have only one direction of all the muscle fibers between their attachment to the bone and their insertion into the tendon. Then if there are 2 directions of those diagonal attachments, it's called bipennate. So in this case there are 2 separate bony areas from which 2 origins of the muscle are happening. but their insertion is into a singular tendinous insertion, and therefore it's called bipinnate. It need not be two different bones, it could be two different areas of the same bone, but the point is that the direction of the muscle fibers, the arrangement parallel to each other, gives it a bipinnate shape. Similarly, it could be a multipinnate shape, where you have the fibers coming from different bar-like or ridge-like or cylinder-like origins, but they are all converging together and doing one common mechanical action, so that the action of that muscle becomes singular, but the multiplication happens in the power of the muscle because of its multipinnate origin. Actually, this, in terms of physics, this is a very marvelously efficient way of conserving bulk but still getting the same mechanical output. If we had put all these fibers together as a triangular shape or a single slab or something, they would, for the amount of work done, they would have delivered less amount of movement. Whereas a multipinnate arrangement allows less amount of muscle tissue, less amount of ATP spent, and still very powerful action. So we'll see, for example, the deltoid muscle of your shoulder where you take your injections. That is of this nature. So there are areas where a great deal of ergonomy is delivered in the body, and the musculoskeletal system is a master at this. The minimum amount of bulk, you deliver maximum amount of mechanical efficiency. Another way of achieving this is that the origins are from if you look at all the origins relative to each other, it is like a circle. So the fibers are coming in from areas which are forming a circle with each other, but they're coming in together into a central situation where they are inserting. So that's like a radial arrangements of fibers. So then the muscle would be called a radial muscle. So these are again terminologies which are almost self-explanatory, but you must remember the meaning of the root Latin word. So unipinnate, bipinnate and multipinnate, and radial arrangement. Then a muscle between its origin and insertion might twist upon its basic axis. So if it's a flat muscle like this and it started like that, then the muscles which started a little distal change direction 90 degrees and go into a different plane. They start on this plane and end up in this plane, right? So they'll spiral on each other, and they will by the time they get to the insert. So when you look at the whole muscle, you'll see that it is slightly turned on itself. So that's called a spiral arrangement. Sometimes it's completely reversed. What has started more proximally ends up attaching more distally, and vice versa. So you will see that in certain areas. When we start upper limb muscles, we will tell you the examples. Then a muscle may have this spiral arrangement around another structure, usually a bony structure like a bone which is coming in between. Then what will happen between its origin and its insertion? If it had not spiraled and it had attached straight, which means it was started at some point and in the same coronal plane it has attached, it will have a certain direction of movement. But because it has attached after spiraling around, that end movement may end up being different. So it's important to remember sometimes where it started, where it ended, and what has happened in between, or what is the direction those muscle fibers took, because that'll help you to understand and to retain what action is happening by its contraction. We will be naming each and every muscle of the musculoskeletal system, but we will do it regionally. So when we start dissections, it'll be easy because you'll be seeing it with your eyes, you'll be seeing where it starts, where it ends, which nerve is supplying it, what is on top of it, beneath it, beside it, right? So you will know all its relations, and we will also talk about its action. Sometimes it's named by, in fact, largely it is named by the shape, because the first muscles which were described, we just looked at their shape. It's obviously fleshy fibers and it's a muscle. So a delta is the way a river enters into the ocean, right? It's a triangular splay of the water entering into the ocean at several points. So when a muscle looks like that triangularly, it has been named the deltoid. That muscle which looked triangular to the first person who named it the deltoid. Similarly, some things looked square, and so they named it quadratus something. Something looked diamond shaped, they named it rhomboid. These are Greek origins. Some looked like a cylinder, rounded shape. They called it teres. One looked very slender, graceful. They called it gracilis. All those which look straight, they're coming from one point and very straight, very obviously going straight to wherever they were going, are called the recti. Singular is rectus, multiple or many muscles together are called the recti. And if it were, there are some muscles which are joining small bones to each other, bringing about small but very fine, very sophisticated movements. And one of them is the lumbricals. So lumbrical, the word means worm-like. So these are only some examples where the root word meaning is according to the shape that was seen of that muscle. Some other times, or when there are 2 or 3 muscles of the same type or doing the same thing or all located in the same place, you want to differentiate between one and the other, and then they were given a second word name depending on their size. So there would be a X muscle, X major, X minor, X major and minor word would differentiate between the fact that those 2 muscles seem to be in the same place doing the same thing, but one is larger and one is smaller. For example, pectoralis major and minor on the front of your chest wall. Similarly, there will be something longus and something brevis. And if there are 3, there may be something magnus, medius, minimus, depending on its size. So brevis means short, longus means long. Latissimus means broadest. Longissimus means longest. So these are the words which are utilized in the naming of the muscles. You just have to know the names. You need not remember or you need not try to remember their origin or anything like that. But the names you must get right, and the spellings are very important. Sometimes they're named by the number of heads or bellies they had. Like we said, no, we said tricipital, we said quadriceps. So like that, biceps means 2 heads, triceps means 3 heads, quadriceps means 4 heads, digastric means 2 bellies, and so on and so forth. Sometimes they're named according to the depth they are, how superficial they are, close to the skin, or how deeply they are placed, closest to the bone. So we will call it XYZ superficialis, XYZ profundus. Profundus mean profound doesn't mean that it is philosophically profound, it just means it is deeply placed. Externus, actually profound philosophically means deep in terms of emotionally, psychologically deep. The other way around. So you may have 2 muscles of the same name with the last word being superficialis or profundus. Similarly, the last word in the name could be externus or internus. That means it is more externally placed, it is more internally placed. Like your abdominal wall muscles, there are 3 layers of them. So the outermost layer will be called the something externus, right? And the next one should probably be called the medius, and the innermost one should be called the internus, logically. So we will see in the thorax and in the abdomen there is a body wall which has layering of muscles. Then you use the word external, internal. The plural is externi, interni. Right? Us is singular, ending in a single I is plural. Sometimes skeletal muscles are named according to their attachment, which is good because that gives you the hint. When we ask you in the viva, so what are the attachments of this muscle, the name itself will give you the answer. Sternocleidomastoid. It's attached to the sternum, it's attached to the clavicle, it's attached to the mastoid process of the temporal bone of the skull. So the name of the muscle describes its attachments on both sides. Similarly, coracobrachialis. It is attached to the coracoid process of the scapula to the arm, to the upper arm bone, that is the humerus. So like that, many muscles are named according to their attachments. A whole bunch of them are named according to their position, which is again easy because it tells you where the muscle is, right? So you can have a serratus anterior, right? You can have a something else posterior, okay? You can have something medial, something lateral, something superior, something inferior, something supraspinatus, infraspinatus. So it tells you the position with reference to the any other word that may be. So supraspinatus would be above the spine, in this case of the scapula, supraspinatus, and so on and so forth. Interosseous, between bones. Dorsi, means of the back. Abdominis obviously means of the abdomen. Pectoralis means of the chest. Brachii means of the upper arm. Anything femoris means of the thigh. Anything oris means of the mouth. Anything oculi means of the eye. Then action words which are in the name of the muscles. So extensor something something. It's telling you what the muscle does. Right? Flexor something something. So flexor of the something, or it may be flexor with a position word or with an attachment word. But the first part of the name is its action. Abductor pollicis, right? Or adductor pollicis. So here what we are saying is, if there is an abductor of the pollex, thumb, which is larger or smaller, right, then there would be a magnus and a brevis. That would be the logic. There is a 3-word name, out of which one is an action word, one is an attachment word, right, and one is whether it's larger or smaller size word. So you have a 3-word named muscle, and its name automatically tells you almost everything about it. So try to think of it that way. You'll get the hang of it as you study forward. But there's no shortcut to remembering each and every name. You know what it's called, where it is, what it does, just has to be learned. So action words, extensor, flexor. Remember we had done pairs of actions right in the first class. So most of them are like that. The muscles are usually arranged in such a way that there will be one which does action A, and there'll be another one which does the exact opposite of that action A. Let's call it action B, right? So both the two, the location, the nerve supply, everything of the muscles will be almost exactly opposite to each other, right? And we will see that today we are only looking at the musculoskeletal system, but when we see the nervous system, we will see that the neuromuscular connection is planned. The design of it is in terms of group action of muscles, not individual. But when we look at it, when it comes to us under the knife, we look at it only by its location and its attachments and its shape and its relations to each other. So by the time we figured out its actions, that can't be done in a dead body, that needs a live person to be able to do it. So that correlation between the physiology of how nerves and muscles work together and the anatomy of where they are and what they look like, it took some time to figure out, right? And it required a lot of living anatomy studies to be able to establish what exactly is happening. And that's why sometimes there are misnomers. We've already called it something, but it turns out it actually does something else. But sometimes those old names have stuck. Whenever these quirky things happen, we will point it out to you, but more or less, largely, the action words are very accurate. So there'll be an extensor of something, there'll be a flexor of the same thing at the same joint. Similarly, abductor, adductor. So opposite pairings, opposite words, which we know work as an agonist action and an antagonist action at the same joint, between the same bones. This is a common norm, but there are exceptions. We will teach you those also. So a levator and a depressor of the same thing at the same joint. Supinator, pronator, constrictor, dilator. So like this, we will have action words which are parts of the names of the skeletal muscles. This bit I think you have already studied. There are some nice illustrations. These are from Gray's Anatomy. One of the things that makes that book so classic is its illustrations. Beautiful 12-color spreads. I think they are accessible to you online, so please go through and look at it, or use a reference book in your library. By the way, you all should insist that you should get your library cards so that you can start using your library as soon as you come to the campus, of course. And maybe we should think about giving you some access to library materials online till you actually get here. If you all are willing to pursue that, then we will put it forward and try to work out something with the college management. So to come back to our story here, any muscle, this one is a fusiform muscle, right? It's a spindle-shaped muscle. We cut it across at somewhere in the middle. And then if you look at it with your naked eye, you see that it's not one single bunch, but a bunch of bunches. It's groups and groups of fibers together in that external wrap of connective tissue. And then you take out any one bunch of it, and inside of it there are another groups cut sections of thinner cylindrical tissue, and you pull out any one of those thinner cylinders, and then you see that each one of these single ones is called a muscle fiber or myofiber, is actually a cell, right? It has got material stuff inside of it. It's got a cell membrane outside of it, but it seems to be an extraordinarily long cell, and it's got a whole bunch of nuclei which will be serving that whole length of cell. So in embryology we'll be teaching you how this happened. How did one single cell become so extraordinarily shaped and so exquisitely grouped together to bring about maximum efficiency of function. So when you have the full muscle, the bundle within it, the set of bundles which it is, each bundle is called a fasciculus. Can you see here? It's a very small print. I'll show here. It is fasciculi. Inside the fasciculi, the individual is called a muscle or myofiber. The root word myo again is from Greek, and everywhere you see the word myo, it refers to muscle, not necessarily skeletal muscle, almost always skeletal muscle. Otherwise we will use certain different names. We will see that later with smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. So a myofiber is nothing but the cellular level of the muscle, and if you cut it open, then this is the cell membrane, the candy stripe, right, the pink and white, and inside that you must have your cell organelles. I think biochemistry has already started talking to you about what a cell is composed of and gone into the details or what makes up everything. So you know that there should be a bunch of intracellular elements inside of the cell. So these look like mitochondria, maybe, yes, cut sections, and there doesn't seem to be any place for cytoplasm because it's completely filled up with these long cylindrical thingies. And somewhere there is also an extra thing which is a completely different structure called a nerve, which seems to be almost inside the cell, right? Looks like that. And we are calling these individual cylinders a myofibrils, and if you pull out one of them, any one of these myofibrils, we see that it is composed of thin and thick filaments. So you keep dissecting it and magnifying it, and you see that the whole bundle of muscles is composed of fasciculi. Each fascicle is composed of myofibers. Each myofiber is the single cell level, the cell level. So inside of that is subcellular elements, most of which are in filament form, long, thin, cylindrical, prolonged, elongated form called filaments, myofibrils. And if you look into the substructure of a myofibril, you will see that it's made up of filaments. So the filaments is the molecular level. These are the actin and myosin molecules which are making up these filaments. So myocyte is the cell level, right? Myofiber, within which are several hundred myofibrils, each of which is composed of several myofilaments. The beauty is that these myofilaments are very specifically organized. Their structure is finite, the way they are organized in groups is finite, the way they are capable of acting or behaving is very structured and limited. It's predefined. They can only do certain things in certain ways, and because they do it with exquisite timing, because of this nerve which is serving them, all of them will slide together, therefore bringing about a concerted contraction or relaxation of the entire bunch of bundles together, delivering maximum mechanical efficiency to the motion. When you look at it in transverse section, under a microscope, you don't see all that. You only see bundles with nuclei pushed to the periphery, right? So you're seeing one cut section. You're seeing one cut section like this, and it may go through some nucleus or not. And if it does, you'll see the nucleus is pushed to the periphery of the cell and staining with the hematoxylin part of the stain. Whereas the cytoplasm component doesn't look like cytoplasm, it's actually completely filled up with these myofilaments, which are not visible very clearly in a TS. But when you see it in an LS, the filaments look like lines. When you see a longitudinal section, which I do not have, when we do histology, I'll show you, which is why the skeletal muscle is also called striated or striped. That was one of the words for it, because when you look at it under the microscope, only in longitudinal section, you see that the inside of the cell looks like it's got striped elements in it. And only skeletal muscle looks so clearly striped. Smooth muscle has the same thing. It has the same myo everything, but the filaments are not so geometrically arranged. Therefore, the way they reflect, the way they take the stain and the way they reflect the light is not so congruent. So you don't get to see the stripes, the filament forms. Whereas in skeletal muscle, that it's almost a military arrangement of fibers in very predictable fashion. That's what makes it striped or striated in nature. In a TS, you won't see that. In a TS, what you will see is that there doesn't seem to be anything in the cytoplasm. It's looking uniform and homogeneous, but there are a few hundred myofibrils in there, and there is energy generating mitochondria, and there are other subcellular organelles also, but we don't get to see them. There's no space for a central nucleus, so it's pushed completely to the periphery, and there'll be several nuclei serving one single longitudinal fiber, which is why it's called a syncytial arrangement. It's like several muscle cells have fused together to serve one single longitudinal structure, and all the nuclei have been pulled together for serving that whole longitudinal structure. So this is a TS. Classification according to the blood supply. Now I mention this because it becomes clinically important. We don't usually discuss this at undergraduate level, but it's good for you to know, because later in surgery we will see that if we're doing something to replace or modify a muscle during a surgery of some other related thing, we must be very careful with its blood supply. Otherwise, in trying to heal something else, we may be knocking off some bits of muscular action. We don't want to do that. We don't want to compromise one function of your patient to save another function. So we must remember that different muscles will have different patterns of blood supply. So here they're just called type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In type 1, you have a singular artery which is getting into the fleshy portion of the muscle and giving branches also into the tendinous portion, such as tensor fascia lata, which is there in the lateral side of your thigh. In the gracilis, as a different example, you have a type 2 arrangement where you have one main vessel but several other alternative blood supplies, and the main one is taking care of the bulk of the muscle fibers, but the little one is probably also sending blood supply to the tendinous insertions. This gracilis is also found in the medial part of your thigh. If you have a more bulky muscle which is tapering towards its insertion but has a lot of fleshy fibers, it may require 2 or 3 main arteries, which is one of the ways in which the gluteus maximus is supplied. So there's a superior and inferior 2 gluteal arteries, both of which are giving branches to this big bulky muscle. But this allows us, I'll come to the implications later, but remember that what this means is that a single muscle may be getting 2 or 3 more than one main artery. Then there will be other muscles. One example is sartorius, where in the type 4 you have same caliber, which means equally big or equal diameter or equal amount of blood supply delivery throughout the length and symmetrically placed. Right? So sartorius is a very long muscle. Again, it's crossing the front of your thigh, and it seems to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this. It's diagrammatic, of course, but 3 or 4 different arterial supplies drawn from probably every artery that crosses this one's territory. So as a muscle is crossing from its origin to its insertion, whichever artery it is going by gives one branch into it, which is a happy arrangement, especially if you need to sacrifice one artery in a particular surgery. You can rest assured that the rest of the muscle its blood supply will take care of what you're leaving behind. So the surgeon needs to have a clear picture of what type of blood supply the muscle has to decide whether I can tie this artery without compromising function of any surrounding structures, or I have to be careful to leave this artery behind and work out some other way of completing my surgery. And then the type 5 blood supply is you have one main supply from one side, and then you have multiple parallel much more minor supplies from another side altogether. This allows us to do some amount of tricky geometric positioning with that if required. And this is a very bulky large muscle, latissimus dorsi, on your back. Again, those who go to gym will know, they call them the lats, they call them the pecs, right? So these are the contour muscles which make up your back. So this one is going to have a type 5 kind of a blood supply. I'll just go through a little bit on the other two types of muscles we have. These are not related to our musculoskeletal system, but for the completion of muscle as a tissue, I will talk about it. So here you can see this muscle cell is not a cylinder. It is a spindle-shaped or fusiform cell with a central nucleus. It also has myofilaments, right? Myofibrils with myofilaments. I'm sorry, you can't call them myofibrils because each of these is a spindle-shaped cell. It's not a long cylindrical continuum syncytial system. So we don't use that word here, but definitely the cellular components are the same. It's the same actin myosin filaments which are inside, but they are not arranged so beautifully congruent and parallel to each other. Therefore, this muscle is not going to be striped or striated in nature. So what we have instead is you have inside, firstly, in between the cells, you have nice gap junctions. Can you see? Gap junctions. And you have desmosomes. And you have this one more, I don't know if they've shown you. Yes, you have dense plaques incorporating integrins. So you have different types of intercellular junctions. Please remember, that structure will be provided because a certain function is in mind. So when you have so many sophisticated intercellular junctions, it allows things to happen between two smooth muscles, which don't happen so well between two skeletal muscles, right? And what that is, can you see here? There is a network of nerve fibers surrounding, right? So this network of nerve fibers is networked around all of the myocytes together, and this intercellular junctioning and this shared neural supply allows these smooth muscles to fire in coordination with each other, setting off waveforms of contraction. This serves viscera very well. So if you have a hollow organ where the smooth muscle which is stimulated in one place will set off a wave, then the whole tube or the whole organ will pulsate or squeeze in a particular way that allows for a coordinated movement, particularly around hollow viscera, which will propel the contents of that viscus. So this arrangement of structure of the smooth muscle myocyte is serving that final function. So just remember, I won't go into subcellular, just to show you what the smooth muscles look like. The muscle part of it is common, meaning that they are contractile cells. To do that, they must have myofilaments, actin and myosin, which are mainly filling up most of the cytoplasm. But in smooth muscle, they're much less in number and they're much more haphazard or non-congruent in arrangement within the cytoplasm. So this orange one is myosin, this green one is actin, and they're looking a little random in their arrangement inside. But they seem to be attached to these brownish blackish bodies, which on the periphery are described as dense plaques and in the inside are described as dense bodies. The cytoplasmic membrane, cell membrane, is called the sarcolemma. It's just a term, right? Lemma is a Greek again root for sheet, like lamina, right? So a sarcolemma is a lamina like wrap like sheet around is the cytoplasmic membrane of a myocyte. Then of course there is a central nucleus. Then there are in between intermediate filaments which are filling up, and there seem to be pits on the surface of the cytoplasmic membrane or sarcolemma which are called caveolae. And when the muscle is in a contracted state, this, what we can see is there are dense plaques on the surface and there are dense bodies in the middle, and they have interconnecting structures between them. When the whole muscle contracts, it's pulling in these surface plaques. Can you see? It's as if it's contracting. And what is happening is the length of the myocyte, each myocyte is shortening, and the width of it is expanding a little bit. And the nucleus seems to have got twisted upon itself, coiled to occupy less space, and then it will kind of become a little more relaxed or stretched. So the way a smooth muscle contraction plays out is very different from the way a skeletal muscle contraction plays out. The structures themselves, basic structures are different, their intercellular attachments are different, the nerve supplies are different, which is what brings about the difference in the way they act. Cardiac muscle has elements of both. So it will have a cytoplasmic membrane or a sarcolemma, which is here. That sarcolemma will wrap up each of the cardiac myocytes, but the way any one cell of it is arranged is somewhat in between a long fiber, a myofiber, and a spindle-shaped smooth muscle cell. So it's not a very long fiber and it's not spindle-shaped, but within that structure, one cell and another cell have intricate junctions with each other. So this cell is ending at this sarcolemma and is thrown up in so many folds. And then it's come down here, and this is again a continuity. So all these are in this cell, this L-shaped cut. Right? The next cell is this one, containing this, these. And between this one and the next one, again, there will be an interlocking kind of junctional situation. On top of that, now in the cell joints which are there between two cardiac muscle cells, the different types. So there is a fascia adherens, there is a gap junction, right? There is a, it's not shown in this particular picture. But the point we are trying to make is that your intercellular junctions are again an important component of cardiac muscle. We'll learn about it in detail in when we do histology. But right now, what we are seeing is the myofilaments seem to be arranged pretty much symmetrically, just like in skeletal muscle. So you have the green and the pink aligning with each other, overlapping with each other. You must have studied it already. We'll teach it again in histology. So you will have a bunch of filaments interacting or sliding against each other. When you look at them all together in a cut section, it looks like this, like a bundle. And in any one myofilament, you will see that these fibrils are sliding on each other. Right? Now the T-tubule is a situation where the external environment between the cell is invaginating and forming a continuity of connection between cells. Now the way they've cut this, the way they've painted this painting to show it is, these are areas in which materials which are flowing in from outside can diffuse through and get into the interior of the cell and be released in the interior of the cell. Similarly, these green things, has this been named here? Okay, I won't go into detail here because this is really PG level. But the green here is the endoplasmic reticulum. I don't know, is it labeled somewhere? Here you have subplasmic reticulum, which has these areas called terminal cisterna. And you remember that endoplasmic reticulum is an intracellular communication mechanism, which is wrapping up all around, very intimately around each of these bundles of myofibrils. Each bundle has got this extremely congruent alignment between actin and myosin filaments, giving them the same efficiency of contraction that skeletal muscle has. But the long continuity of myofibers is interrupted in cardiac muscle, and the intercellular junctions are much more like smooth muscle, and position of nucleus is central. Where is your nucleus? They haven't put one in this picture, but position of the nucleus is central, not peripheral. And there is a whole new type of junction called the intercalated disc, which is visible to the low power magnification, and that's how we identify the cardiac muscle. We will come to that later, but remember, because of this arrangement, this is also a striated type of muscle. or a striped muscle. So cardiac muscle has the striped look of skeletal muscle, but not so sharply. So if I put a skeletal muscle slide and I put a cardiac muscle slide, and you unfocus your eyes a little bit and look into the microscope, the skeletal muscle stripes or striations will be very clear. Comparatively, cardiac muscle striations will be less clear. Both have to be seen in longitudinal section for you to be able to appreciate this. But the position of nuclei for skeletal muscle will be peripheral, and the position of nuclei for cardiac muscle will be central. That will differentiate the two. And this central position of cardiac muscle is a feature which is similar to smooth muscle. But in smooth muscle, you won't be able to see the striations at all because they are not so congruently arranged. All of them are muscle, therefore they are contractile cells. They do have myofilaments, actin and myosin, all arranged to be able to slide upon each other, all neuron networked to be able to fire in coordinated ways, right? But slightly different depending on the organ function which they are serving. For musculoskeletal system, skeletal muscle is serving the organ function of movement, moving one bone against another at a mobile joint, or moving the whole body across space, right? In which case, the efficiency of contraction, the consuming of energy, all has to be served in the most efficient way possible. So skeletal muscle gets a very good blood supply, has got a lot of ATP, lot of Golgi apparatus, lot of mitochondria. The cell metabolism is high, but most places it's not vital to life. Most places, the viscera where that muscle is provided, the action of your heart, cardiac muscle, the action of your digestive organs are likely to be much more vital to life. So again, there is a functional difference. There is a locational difference, and therefore there is a functional difference in what is going to be done with it. In a few places there will be exceptions. The skeletal muscle, we called it voluntary, so it should be served by that part of your nervous system which can bring about voluntary action, right? Cardiac and visceral or smooth muscle are usually serving these organs, internal structures, internal organ systems, which are involuntary. They have to be served by autonomic kind of nerve supply. But that is not always the case. In some cases, you will see skeletal muscle structure served by an autonomic kind of a nerve. In some cases, you will see a smooth muscle structure but served by a voluntary kind of nerve. So those exceptions we'll mention as and when you come across. It's quite fascinating. But apart from its use as MCQs, what you have to always remember is that that exception also happened either because of the exquisite development, what happened in embryology, or because in that particular location it has some very unique function which is being served. Alright, so I'll stop here as far as skeletal system is concerned. We won't come to this we will come as a next step after finishing joints, because in the musculoskeletal system we talked about bone and how we have classified it. Now we talk today about muscle, how we have classified it. We concentrated mainly on how the muscles are classified, and we said particularly skeletal muscles are divided or classified or studied in terms of their morphological types, how they look to the naked eye, how their gross anatomy is, because this is how you will come to them when you do dissection. This is how you will handle them in real life, in your patients. You will actually be handling the bulk of muscles. You will be examining patients for the location, function, distortions of their muscles. You will be asking them questions about whether that muscle is, or they'll be complaining about how weak it feels or how it's not able to do a certain action. And from that you will be deriving information of what is happening inside and what do you need to do to correct that problem. So the naming is about shape. It comes from their size, it comes from their depth, their attachment, their position, and the actions that they have. There are a whole lot of muscles. I haven't counted, I don't know how many they are. The way you have this, 206 bones. It's not like that. Maybe somebody should do an exercise and actually count. By the time you finish all the dissection from head to toe, maybe you should get a estimate of how many skeletal muscles you have, which we have bothered to name. Okay, it doesn't serve much practical purpose, but just interesting fun fact, maybe. All right, and its substructure is what makes it so unique and so special. Please don't forget this, go home and revise this, and we will go into further detail at biochemistry level when we come to histology. Okay. Right, so I'll end the class here. Bye for now, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Oh, I'm sorry, tomorrow is Saturday. I'll see you again on Monday. Have a good weekend.